here at the Maier, and it's so great to have such a wonderful room full of wonderful people this afternoon. This lecture series is established and supported by the Honorable Paul Whitehead Jr. in 2018 in memory of his wife Sandra Stone Whitehead, annually highlights works from the collection. The subject of the first lecture in 2018, Andrew Wyeth's Burning Off, was purchased for the museum in 1998 with funds provided by Paul in honor of Sandra. Sandra was a longtime supporter of the Maier and painter in her own right, volunteering her time to the museum as a docent for more than a decade. Sandra also continued her study of art history and studio art on this campus, as well as in Maine and abroad. She worked in oil, creating primarily landscapes, and her work was included in many exhibitions. I'd like to say thank you to President Baker for being with us today, and I'd like to extend a special welcome to Paul and Sandra's family. Paul, in particular. And Sandra's mother, Mrs. Russell Stone, up here in the front row. Welcome. Paul Whitehead III here in the front row. Jill, Paul's daughter, and her daughter Ellie, who's here right next to Paul. So thank you for being here. I also wanted to thank Nancy and Bob Sykes, because they're the ones who really made the connection with Shannon Vittoria and persuaded her to come here for this special lecture. So thank you, Nancy and Bob, for that. Shannon Vittoria joined the American wing of the Metropolitan Museum of American Art in October 2015. She specializes in American painting and works on paper with a focus on landscape art and women artists. She contributed to research and organization of Thomas Cole's Journey, Atlantic Crossings, the exhibition in 2018. As an Andrew W. Mellon Curatorial Fellow in the department from 2013 to 14, she assisted with research for Thomas Hart Benton's America Today Mural Rediscovered 2014-15. Vittoria received her PhD in art history from the City University of New York's Graduate Center, where she completed her doctoral dissertation, Nature and Nostalgia in the Art of Mary Moran, 1842 to 1899, fascinating work. She has held curatorial research positions at the Frick Collection, the Morgan Library and Museum, and the New York Historical Society. Please join me in welcoming Shannon Vittoria.
Hi, good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to be here today, and I just want to reiterate what Martha said and thank Paul and Bob and Nancy and Martha and all of her staff here at the Maier Museum for having me today, organizing my travel and my talk. This is actually my first time in Lynchburg, and I had the pleasure this morning of touring the collection and the museum. And after studying some of the works the past few months and little small pictures on my computer, it was so thrilling to be able to see the artworks firsthand in person. And I hope today that this lecture will shed some new light on some of the works in the collection and give you some food for thought. And I look forward to the discussion that we have afterwards. So by way of background, I was part of the curatorial team, as Martha mentioned, who organized and worked for really almost 4 years on the exhibition and accompanying publication, Thomas Cole's Journey, Atlantic Crossings, which was first at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and then it traveled to the National Gallery in London. It was a project that was born out of our desire to rethink Thomas Cole, the great American, I put that in scare quotes because we're going to deconstruct exactly what that means today, landscape painter and founder of the so-called Hudson River School. We wanted to rethink Thomas Cole in an international and transatlantic context. And our objective was to reconsider his quintessentially American landscapes, works very similar in subject matter and theme to the Maier Museum's Corway Peak, New Hampshire, 1844, within the context of Cole's European roots and transatlantic travels. The show marked the 200th anniversary of Thomas Cole's first Atlantic crossing, when he emigrated from England to the United States in 1818, and then it examined in depth Cole's return journey to England from 1829 to 1831, and his travels throughout the continent, most importantly to Italy from 1831 to 32. At the heart of the show, we re-examined iconic works created by the artist in the years immediately following his return to New York in 1832, including his iconic The Oxbow, which is in our collection at the Met, and the Course of Empires series, the central picture of which you see here on the right. These iconic landscapes were presented as culminating creative responses to Cole's complex experiences with British art and society, and of Italian history and the landscape. Moreover, as a result of Cole's abiding passion for the American wilderness, we argued that these paintings were fervent visual warnings to his fellow American citizens, one could say both in his time and in ours, of the harsh ecological costs of unchecked development on the land. And we positioned Cole as a kind of proto-environmentalist, an artist who decried the destruction of nature at the expense of the so-called progress and improvements of man. With this exhibition, we set out to not only rethink Thomas Cole and his achievements, but in the process to also rewrite the history of landscape painting in the United States, particularly the nationalistic stories surrounding the founding of the so-called Hudson River School. To do so, we brought prominence to the dialogue that existed between American and European artists in the mid-19th century by hanging Cole's works in direct juxtaposition with the works he studied on his formative journey, including paintings by the great J.M.W. Turner and John Constable, among others. We also set out to re-examine Cole's extraordinary legacy, notably in the work of the next generation of American landscape painters whom he personally mentored, including Asher B. Durand and Frederick Church, delineating the ways in which the next generation of landscape artists were both inspired by Cole's processes and techniques, and yet dramatically departed from their mentor on ideological grounds. So today I would like to explore in greater detail the findings of our exhibition and posit ways in which the lessons we learned offer opportunities for reinterpreting the careers and works of landscape painters of the 19th century in a broader international context, continuing to upend the nationalistic story that for so long has defined the history of American landscape art from Thomas Cole to Thomas Moran. Now, the story of the National School of Landscape Painting in the US actually begins in the north of England, specifically in Bolton, Lancashire, where Thomas Cole was born in 1801 at the height of Britain's Industrial Revolution. As a child, he experienced firsthand some of the worst effects of England's rapid industrialization, including privation, pollution, and social unrest. Paintings such as Philip James de Lutherberg's Coalbrookdale by Night, seen here on the left, and painted coincidentally the year of Thomas Cole's birth, 1801, provides us with a glimpse into the tumultuous landscape of his youth. It depicts a fiery iron foundry, sort of belching smoke, in the nearby town of Coalbrookdale, epitomizing the horrors of the industrial sublime. Other British artists, notably Joseph Mallord William Turner, who would profoundly influence Cole later in his life, also executed views of the British countryside transformed by industry. His exquisite watercolor of Leeds, seen here on the right, was painted in 1816 when Cole was residing in nearby Lancashire with his family, and it highlights the growing industrial presence in the landscape. In the fore and middle ground, we see manual laborers, factories, and smokestacks as the city teems with commercial activity. But up above, in the distance, Turner also included the moors, or the British pasture land, which at the time remained largely untouched by industrial development. Like Leeds, Thomas Cole's hometown of Bolton was similarly laid out, with the industrial city in the valley below and the moorlands up above. From his biography, we know that in his youth, Cole would often escape the town of Bolton and travel up into the moors to read poetry and play music. And this binary, this tension between nature and industry, would come to define Thomas Cole's life and later landscape paintings. Bolton was a kind of ground zero for industrialization. In 1779, the English inventor Samuel Crompton, who was living in Bolton, invented the spinning mule, which was really the machine that revolutionized the textile industry and brought about the shift of weaving from the home to the factory, eventually putting many skilled hand-loom weavers, including Thomas Cole's own father, out of business. This in turn led to mass uprisings as groups of hand-loom weavers, known as the Luddites, fought against the increased mechanization of the textile industry. The first Luddite rebellion took place in Bolton in 1812 as unemployed workers began burning factories and breaking machinery, as you see satirized here in the print on the left. Cole witnessed this social unrest firsthand, and shortly after the first Luddite rebellion, he himself was forced to take employment in a textile factory. As a teenager, he worked in a cotton mill as an engraver of the blocks from which colorful fabrics, known as calicos, were printed. On the right, you see the Peel Pattern Book, which is a calico sample book from a Bolton printworks that dates to the precise years that Thomas Cole was employed in one such factory. The object is fascinating in that it documents the colorful patterns that were being produced in calico factories during Cole's youth and provides us with great insights into the types of textile factories that Cole may have had a hand in producing. Many of the patterns draw on natural forms for inspiration. There are various flowers and leaves and beautifully extracted vegetation, and we can see that drawing and designing such patterns would have required a certain degree of skill, and this job thus provided Thomas Cole with his earliest artistic training. After struggling to find work in Bolton, Cole's family eventually moved to Liverpool in 1817. But shortly thereafter, it became clear to Cole's father that making a living as a textile worker in England was going to be nearly impossible. And in 1818, the family crossed the Atlantic for the first time, departing Liverpool and arriving in Philadelphia. Early on, Cole was determined to become an artist. He learned initially from borrowed textbooks and took lessons as an itinerant portrait painter. Then, in the summer of 1823, he began traveling throughout the forests of western Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh, where he executed a series of pen-and-ink drawings focusing primarily on trees. The work on the left is actually inscribed along the bottom, and it says that it was drawn from nature, and it depicts a rather anthropomorphic tree with human-like characteristics. It almost appears as if the tree is about to sort of get up and walk off the page. Throughout his life, Cole had very strong emotional connections to trees, often comparing them to men with unique personalities. Following these initial endeavors, Cole decided to pursue a professional career as an artist, and he moved to New York City in 1825. That summer, he made his first trip up the Hudson River, traveling by steamboat as far north as Catskill, New York. The sketches he made on this trip served as the basis for his earliest wilderness pictures, in which he eliminated all signs of tourism and industry to convey a vision of the landscape before European settlement. These bold early paintings, such as View of the Round Top in the Catskill Mountains, seen here, were an instant success with American audiences, as he presented them with a daring new vision of the American wilderness. After the success of his early Catskill pictures, Cole continued to explore the landscape of the eastern seaboard, traveling as far north as the White Mountains in New Hampshire. He was among the first of many painters and authors to explore the celebrated region of New England, capturing the landscape's grandeur and majesty in his sketchbooks and writings. Cole traveled to New Hampshire first in the summer of 1827, and then again in the fall of 1828, making the latter trip with fellow artist and friend Henry Pratt Cheever, who here depicted Cole sketching out of doors on one of their rambles, as they called them. While in New Hampshire, Cole was especially drawn to Mount Chicora, a nearly 3,500-foot peak in the White Mountains, notable for its irregular pyramidal shape, visible from several vantage points in both New Hampshire and Maine. Cole sketched the monumental form from a variety of angles, and later wrote that the scene unified in his mind's eye the picturesque, the sublime, and the magnificent, describing the peak as, quote, the finest one I have ever beheld. Cole may have also been drawn to the mountain's legend, which evolved throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries. In its most basic form, it recounts the story of a Native American chief known as Chicora, who was said to have been pursued to the mountain's summit by a group of white men. Upon reaching the top, Jocora leapt to his death, but not before uttering a curse on the land, which was later blamed for the high mortality of cattle who grazed near the foot of the mountain. The mountain's sublime physical form, as well as its rich folklore, provided Cole with a subject he used and reused in a variety of visual contexts, and his sketches from 1827 and 28 served as the basis for several finished oil pictures throughout his life. Not only did he incorporate Mount Jocora into his popular wilderness pictures, one of which we see here, but he also adapted it to fit what he called his landscapes of a higher style, that is to say, works that were inspired by literary and religious subjects. In 1827, for example, Cole set out to paint a series of landscapes drawn from James Fenimore Cooper's best-selling novel, The Last of the Mohicans. In this painting, now in the collection of the Wadsworth Athenaeum, Cole combines the real with the ideal. Although Cooper had set his scene at Lake George, Cole chose the White Mountains for his painting, introducing Mount Jocora in the distance. Similarly, when he painted the Garden of Eden, a pivotal work in the artist's career, he used sketches from the previous summer's trip to New Hampshire, adding Mount Jocora's striking pyramidal form in the distance, although here framed by palm trees and exotic flora. Cole would return to this subject matter at various moments in his career, including in 1844 when he painted the landscape now in the Maier Museum's collection. And although it is believed that he used this sketch as the basis for his later trip, his attitudes toward art making, and perhaps more importantly towards the fate of the American wilderness, developed and changed dramatically in the 26 years that separates these two works. And I would argue that to fully understand Cole's later wilderness pictures, especially a work such as Corway Peak, we have to reinterpret them within the context of both his youth in the north of England and his first formative return trip to Europe, which profoundly altered his attitudes toward both art and nature. Now, the impetus behind Thomas Cole's return journey was first sparked in November of 1827, when he received a letter from the American artist Washington Allston, which encouraged him to return to the Old World for an extended period of study. In the letter, Allston advised Cole to go, quote, first to England, where I would remain at least half of the time we propose to pass abroad. The present English school comprises a great body of excellent artists. At the head, you will find Turner, who has no superior of any age. After England, Allston advised Cole that he should spend a short time in France and then the remainder of his time in Italy. It took Cole nearly 2 years to raise the money necessary to finance his trip abroad, but he eventually succeeded, packing his trunk, which remarkably still exists today at the Thomas Cole National Historic Site, filled with his sketchbooks and rolled canvases and artist supplies, departing New York City on June 1st of 1829 and arriving in London a mere 26 days later. And when I first learned that, I promised I would never complain about the overnight flight to London ever again. Cole quickly immersed himself in London's art world, visiting both public and private collections that held riches for the young artist. One of his first stops was to the National Gallery, established in 1824, just 5 years prior to Cole's trip. At the time of Cole's visit, the National Gallery did not yet have a building, and the collection hung in the home of collector J.J. Angerstein. This watercolor provides great insight into the works that Cole saw when he visited the collection, and from his writings, we know that he was especially enraptured by the landscapes of 17th-century French painter Claude Lorraine, including his seaport with the embarkation of St. Ursula, a work that had, as Cole wrote in his journal, the most beautiful pearl-like effect of light. In addition to the National Gallery, Cole also visited the annual exhibitions of the Royal Academy and the British Institution, where he saw and studied works by leading contemporary British landscape painters of the day, most notably J.M.W. Turner and John Constable. At the Royal Academy, he studied large-scale, or the so-called six-footer landscapes by both Turner and Constable, including Hadley Castle, which you see here on the right, with its image of a ruined tower, one that would both haunt and inspire Thomas Cole for the rest of his life. In the same exhibition, he also saw Turner's masterpiece, Ulysses deriding Polyphemus, seen here at left. Although Cole had been familiar with Turner's work through black and white reproductive prints that were circulating around New York City in the 1820s, when he saw the artist's paintings firsthand, he was completely blown away. Impressed most especially by Turner's use of color, his vivid brushstrokes and use of impasto, and his progressive compositional arrangements. Cole quickly realized that he had very much to learn from the modern master, and while viewing this painting on exhibition at the Royal Academy, he actually executed a series of pencil sketches after the picture, taking careful compositional notes and recording the artist's use of chiaroscuro and color with detailed notations that read green, orange, purple, bright yellow, etc. Although Cole was hugely impressed by Turner's work, when he met the artist in person, visiting his studio in December of 1829, poor Thomas Cole was hugely disappointed. He had envisioned Turner to be a refined gentleman, someone that Cole himself had aspired to be. But unfortunately for the young artist, Turner was quite the opposite. He was short and stocky, crude and gruff, and in his journal, Cole referred to him as, quote, a common man of common countenance. The younger artist simply could not understand how a man who looked like Turner could paint works that looked like Hannibal crossing the Alps. It was in Turner's studio that Cole first saw the painting that really affected him the most, and that was Snowstorm Hannibal Crossing the Alps, painted in 1812. It's a work that Cole wrote had a great effect of chiaroscuro, and the drama and power of Turner's swirling vortex would stick with Cole throughout his career. Although Turner the man disappointed Cole, he was very much more impressed by Turner's great rival, John Constable, who Cole met and came to know while living in London. Constable embodied the gentleman artist that Cole himself aspired to be, and as we suspect, Constable was perhaps a little bit nicer to Cole than Turner had been, taking the young artist under his wing and inviting him to his studio and to visit picture collections together. In addition to Constable's 6-footers, which Cole saw on public display, he also had the opportunity to visit the artist's studio and study his oil studies, most notably his plein air or out-of-door cloud studies that he had been executing in the 1820s. These are the works, and these works are ones that Constable actually never exhibited during his lifetime, and they would have been unframed, lying around the artist's studio as a sort of loose-leaf sheets of paper, raw artist materials to be incorporated into finished pictures. Constable was perhaps the greatest painter of clouds ever, hands down, and Cole was deeply inspired by his ability to use clouds to capture and convey meaning. In a famous letter penned in October of 1821, Constable wrote, quote, "I have done a great deal of skying. That landscape painter who does not make his sky a very material part of his composition neglects to avail himself of one of his greatest aids. It will be difficult to name a class of landscape in which the sky is not the keynote, the standard of scale, and the chief organ of sentiment." Cole would later echo Constable's statement, writing that the sky is, quote, "the soul of all scenery. In it are the fountains of light and shade and color." Constable's ability to capture in oil the dramatic atmospheric effects of shifting light, clouds, and weather in the landscape made a lasting impression on Cole, who would go on to experiment with painting out of doors once he arrived in Italy. And his practice of the on-site oil sketch became, as we will see, a defining part of Thomas Cole's legacy, with the next generation of landscape painters working in the United States. Now, after 2 incredibly formative years in England, Cole followed the itinerary that had been laid out for him by Washington Allston, who he himself in turn was following generations of European artists before him, and he made his way from England to Italy by way of France. Cole stopped over in Paris. He apparently deeply despised everything he saw in the Louvre, and after just 9 days, continued on to Florence, settling into a room and studio on the Via Valfonda by June of 1831. Cole's time in Italy was not only informative, but incredibly productive. He traveled around frequently, sketching detailed works in graphite, his usual working method which he had established prior to his European journey, as well as in oil, a practice that he studied, developed, and then really mastered while abroad. He traveled with his portable paint box, seen here on the right, to iconic locations around Italy, such as the Colosseum, which he wrote in his journal was the object that affected him the most. He took several sketches of the interior and one oil study of the ruins' contours, all in preparation for the painting seen here. Cole's view shows an enclosed space with plant life emerging along the inner arches and the earthen floor, very different from the sort of dry Colosseum that you see nowadays when you go to visit. Like the European artists before him, he took an interest in the rich flora in the Colosseum, and he sketched individual plants, while also collecting specimens, which he pressed into an album that remarkably still survives today. In his finished work, Cole actually removed a restoration from the upper tier of the east entrance, thus giving the monument an irregular contour that emphasized the sort of picturesque melancholy that the ruin evoked for him. Cole's fascination with ruins in nature also brought him out to the Roman Campania, where he continued to hone and really master the art of the on-site oil study. He sketched sections of the Claudian aqueduct at various times of day. The scene on the left was painted in full daylight with lush, wet brushstrokes. And later that same day, he rendered the scene again, but painted it in the diminishing light of early evening with an emerging moon in the sky. It's also worth noting that while Cole was sketching these sites in and around Rome, he was doing so in the company of other, mostly international artists. The ruins he sought out were not unusual or unknown, although he often would tell his American patrons that they were. But for the most part, they had already been widely popularized throughout Europe by the large community of foreign artists, especially from the north, who made their way to Italy generation after generation. We should therefore imagine Thomas Cole with his paint box, easel, and umbrella seated alongside other artists in the Campania, who were similarly there to execute oil studies in preparation for their finished pictures. Cole's aqueduct near Rome, which was based on his on-the-spot oil studies, was painted in Florence during a period of intense productivity for the artist. In fact, as he later wrote to friend William Dunlap, quote, "I painted more pictures in 3 months than I have ever done in twice the time before or since. I was truly in the spirit of it." Now, one particular aspect of Thomas Cole's time in Italy that has been almost entirely overlooked in the literature on the artist is his study of the figure, a practice that he dedicated considerable time to while in Florence. Shortly after arriving, he was accepted into Florence's esteemed Academy of Fine Arts, where he worked under Italian academicians. He soon received permission to study from the live nude model, which was an essential step in the training of any aspiring history painter, and one that really proved to be pivotal for Thomas Cole's artistic development. The American sculptor, Horatio Greenough, who was a close colleague and friend of Cole's in Florence, remarked upon his progress, writing to their mutual acquaintance, the author James Fenimore Cooper, that Cole was, quote, "studying the figure with astonishing success. He's going to be a great artist. I shall always be very proud of having induced him to study the figure. I knew by his pale face and eternal sign that mere landscape of any class was too small a ball for his caliber." Luckily for us, despite Greenough's assertion, Cole continued to sketch from nature. In 1831, he executed this detailed panoramic study of Florence, seen from the small convent church, San Miniato Almonte, which is a famous promontory overlooking the city. Cole's meticulous graphic rendering of the scene stretches across 2 pages of his sketchbook. The panoramic drawing is filled with inscriptions on the upper left and right, including a numbered list of the buildings of Florence and descriptions of the quality of light, seen, as Cole noted, half an hour before sunset. He later used his sketches to execute this spectacular view of Florence, a grand panoramic painting that is considered to be the earliest view of the scene by an American artist. This work would go on to inspire subsequent generations of American painters to visit the site and execute their own rendition of the scene. Although today, Thomas Cole is not particularly well known for his Italian landscapes, these works were wildly popular with American collectors in the 19th century, and he painted such scenes as long as the market demanded. This painting, for example, was executed 6 years after the graphite study, and he continued to mine his Italian sketchbooks for subject matter throughout his lifetime. Now, after nearly 3 years abroad, Cole finally returned to the United States from Europe. The trip, which had been transformative for the young artist, inspired him to embark upon his most ambitious work to date, the Course of Empire. This series, which traces the rise and decline of a great civilization, was deeply indebted both aesthetically and thematically to Cole's time in England and Italy. In fact, it was a series that he first began to ponder while in London, and then further developed amongst the ruins of ancient Rome. As a 5-painting series, however, it was going to be an enormous, expensive undertaking, and Cole sought out a patron who could commission the series. Luckily, he had recently met a New York-based grocer by the name of Luman Reed, who was in the midst of building a mansion and picture gallery in Lower Manhattan, which he had planned to outfit with works by contemporary American artists. Cole sent this drawing to Reed, outlining his initial plan for the 5 paintings, which were intended to hang in Reed's living room, with the third picture, the largest in the series, hanging directly over the fireplace. This arrangement is how the series is most often displayed. However, in our recent exhibition at the Met, we wanted to look at these 5 pictures anew, and thus installed them in a slightly different configuration, creating a space in which the drama unfolds before the viewer in a panoramic sweep. Traveling from left to right, we see the savage state, as well as the Arcadian and pastoral state, depicting the wilderness and the beginnings of civilization, respectively. Next, we reach what Cole called the consummation of empire, in which nature, at the hands of man's greed and hubris, has been almost entirely destroyed. Up next, we have destruction, in which chaos and violence prevail, before nature takes back that which man built, regenerating itself, even as the fate of humanity remains unclear, as we see in the final picture, desolation. Now, to fully unpack this incredibly complex series, I would probably need another 2 hours. But for our purposes today, I want to highlight the ways in which the series responds to the experiences of Thomas Cole's journey. From the swirling vortices of Turner, which he quotes in Destruction, to the haunting tower of Constable's Hadley Castle, which we see in Desolation, as well as the ruined remains of the Roman Empire, which Cole saw and sketched while in Italy. It was a series that was painted as a kind of manifesto to the American public, a visual warning of the path that he feared his newly adopted nation was about to embark upon. And Cole had in fact become an American citizen in 1834, just as he was beginning this series. Upon returning to the United States in 1832, he was greatly dismayed to learn of the re-election of President Andrew Jackson, a figure whom Cole abhorred and whom he was likely referencing in the depiction of an emperor atop an elephant in Consummation. Cole was increasingly disturbed by the ongoing destruction of the wilderness as a result of Jackson's policies supporting westward expansion and rapid industrialization. As Cole saw it, his new nation was heading down a dangerous path, one that he knew all too well from his youth in the north of England and saw the aftermath of while in Italy. He feared that his new nation would soon follow suit as it moved closer and closer to consummation, destruction, and eventually dissolution. Cole envisioned this series as a cautionary tale, a kind of visual warning to his fellow citizens. It's an incredibly powerful message, and one that he similarly embedded into his later wilderness landscapes, most notably in his masterpiece painting The Oxbow, which he completed in 1836 while he was still at work on the course of empire. Embracing the panoramic mode, it is a picture that addresses many of the same concerns presented in the course of empire, but here distilled down into a single painting. Adopting the radical compositional formula of a bifurcated landscape, Cole divided the scene into 2 along a sweeping diagonal. On the left of the composition, he painted pure American wilderness, his beloved subject, with anthropomorphic trees, a blasted tree trunk, and bolts of lightning. He juxtaposes this with the valley below, in which every inch of the landscape has been altered by the hand of man. He even included signs of clear-cutting or deforestation on the mountainside in the distance, and then positioned himself in the landscape, firmly on the side of wilderness. Looking directly out at the viewer, he poses a profound question to us, a question that is perhaps echoed in the exaggerated form of the Oxbow itself. How much of the wilderness are you willing to preserve? Will you allow man to completely alter and destroy the landscape? And with this work, we believe that Cole challenged the public to consider the moral value of maintaining these sublime aspects of nature. Over the course of the late 1830s and early 40s, Cole witnessed the escalating destruction of the forests, and his journals and letters from this period are filled with angry outbursts. Some of them are mildly entertaining. Writing to a patron in 1836, for example, he exclaimed, quote, "The copper-hearted barbarians are cutting all the trees down in the beautiful valley on which I have looked so often with a loving eye." He then invited his patron to join him in condemning all of the, quote, "dollar-godded utilitarians." In the winter of 1836 to 37, Cole's dismay led him to paint this view of Catskill Creek as a kind of memory piece. Writing in his journal, he described the scene. Quote, "The vicinity of the site from which this view was taken was a favorite haunt of mine, but its beauty has passed away. The valley is desolate and the magnificent woods have all been felled. I take pleasure in thinking that my picture may for years to come tell what the valley of the Catskill was before what is called improvements blasted the scene." 6 years later, he returned to the same locale, this time approaching it as a kind of anti-pastoral, to quote from the art historian Alan Wallach, who has described this picture as a dark view of the valley's present and future. Here, the looming figure of a man with an axe surveys the panoramic prospect before him. The lush, framing trees are now gone, and he is instead surrounded by tree trunks and discarded tree limbs, a barren landscape, a graveyard of sorts, which has been altered by man. And for Cole, the final straw was the railroad, cutting across the valley and destroying the landscape, as he wrote, most notably the charm and solitude and quietness which is now forever gone. During this moment of railroad fever, when most Americans saw the train as a symbol of progress and innovation, a metaphor for manifest destiny, Cole was horrified by its intrusion into his local landscape. The very next year, he painted Corway Peak, New Hampshire, and, as I would argue, it's within the context of his increasing environmental angst that we should understand and interpret this picture. Much like Cole's view on the Catskill early autumn, it is a work that preserves, at least visually, a landscape that he believed was under attack. The White Mountains were an increasingly popular tourist destination, one that he feared would soon suffer the same fate as his beloved Catskill Valley. As sites of pure wilderness were rapidly disappearing, the artist painted landscapes to preserve what remained of nature, or God's pure creation, as he described it. To further underline this point, Cole often included small Native Americans in his landscapes. And we see this in another, slightly earlier example of another Mount Chicora scene painted in autumn now at the New York Historical Society. In both works, Cole included a Native figure in the foreground, in the left, paddling in a canoe, and on the right, sitting atop a rocky outcropping. In the Maier Museum's work, he also included two small Native figures in the distance, perhaps a reference to the legend of the Native chief who was believed to have led to his death from Mount Chicora. Like other artists of his generation, Cole believed that Native peoples were a vanishing race. As we saw, he had used Mount Chicora in the past as a backdrop for literary subject matter, including scenes featuring Native peoples, such as The Last of the Mohicans, which we see here, and he continued to include Native Americans in his landscapes as nostalgic emblems of the past. Often posed in positions reminiscent of ancient Greco-Roman sculpture, he saw Native peoples as the antiquities of America, destined to disappear along with the natural world they once inhabited. And although Cole railed against the destruction of the wilderness, he was unfortunately less concerned with the fate of the Native communities who, and I believe it's absolutely critical to note, had been living in Cole's pure wilderness for thousands of years prior to Euro-American settlement. Now, I'd like to turn our attention to exploring more of the legacy of Thomas Cole, especially as it pertains to the next generation of American landscape painters, including those whom he mentored, such as Frederick Church, a work of which we see here on the right, and Asher B. Durand. Cole was the first, and certainly one of the most influential American artists to work directly from nature. Having studied the great cloud studies of Constable in London, he mastered the art of the outdoor oil sketch and impressed on his followers the critical value of direct observation. Church, who spent 2 years in Cole's Catskill studio, would go on to produce an exquisite body of cloud studies, surpassing even his master's abilities. And while I could go on and on about Frederick Church's oil studies, endlessly, they're some of my favorite works ever painted, I want to focus our attention now on Asher B. Durand, since one of his landscapes is in the collection here at the Maier. Durand first became acquainted with Cole's work in the fall of 1825, when he purchased a painting by the then unknown artist out of a shop window in New York City for $25. It was not until the 1830s, however, that the two men developed a close friendship. In the summer of 1837, Cole and Durand set off on a sketching tour of Shroon Lake in the Adirondack Mountains. The trip was pivotal in Durand's career, marking his decided shift from figure painting to landscape painting. In his Shroon Lake sketchbook, Durand executed a beautiful trompe-l'oeil drawing featuring 3 stacked landscape studies, the top one of which depicts a pastoral lake scene framed by trees. The following year, Cole completed Study for Dream of Arcadia, seen on the left, a small trompe-l'oeil painting with a pastoral Italianate landscape, executed to resemble a wet oil study tacked to a wood board, complete with painted wood grain and a faux knothole. Cole gave this work to Durand as a token of their friendship and as a memory of their trip to the Adirondacks. And along with the actual physical picture, he passed on to Durand his passion for the Italian landscape and the practice of sketching in oil, both of which defined his legacy and later shaped Asher B. Durand's success. When Thomas Cole unexpectedly died in 1848 at the age of 47, Durand paid homage to his friend and mentor in a memorial landscape picture entitled Kindred Spirits. Featuring a posthumous portrait of Cole, who stands next to his friend, the nature poet William Cullen Bryant, this landscape is a composite of Cole and Durand's favorite sites in the Catskill Mountains, including Catterskill Clove and Catterskill Falls. In the wake of Cole's death, Durand would continue to follow in his mentor's footsteps, visiting and painting many of these same sites that Cole popularized in his earlier landscapes. In 1855, for example, Durand spent the summer in the White Mountains of New Hampshire sketching Mount Chicora. The anthropomorphic trees on the left and blasted tree trunks in the foreground reveal the lasting influence of Cole, whose vision of the American wilderness continued to inform the ways in which generations of painters viewed and depicted the landscape. That same year, 1855, Durand published his letters on landscape painting, aimed at advising younger artists on what to paint, in his opinion, their native land, and how to paint it directly from nature. These were the principles that Durand first learned from Cole, which he then codified in his letters, and then practiced throughout his career. In the Sketcher of 1870, we see Durand continuing to follow his mentor's advice, working from nature, much as the two artists had done in the Adirondacks more than 30 years prior. It's also worth noting that by 1870, painting out of doors was widespread, practiced by landscape artists working across the country, including those working in places further afield, including a local artist, Flavius Fisher, who I look forward to learning more about from all of you. When I first saw this work online, I was struck by the intimate nature of the scene, as we are given a kind of voyeuristic, behind-the-scenes look at the artist at work. And I was immediately reminded of Cole's self-portrait in the Oxbow, in which we see the tools of the plein air artist's trade, including an umbrella, a camp stool, a portfolio, and an easel. Thus far, I've been highlighting the crucial lessons that Cole passed on to his predecessors, but it's equally as important to emphasize the ways in which the next generation of artists, and especially Durand, also moved in new directions after mid-century. And I had to go through my slide presentation and change the credit line here, since this was recently gifted, as many of you may know, to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. A critical aim of our exhibition was to draw clear distinctions between the ideological underpinnings of Cole's works and those of his followers, thus breaking down the notions of homogeneity that often define the anachronistic term of the Hudson River School. Comparing, for example, Durand's progress to Cole's The Oxbow really drives this point home. Like Cole, Durand painted a bifurcated landscape, juxtaposing wilderness on the left with commercial development on the right, including all forms of modern technology, from the telegraph to the train. Yet unlike Cole, who questioned and deeply regretted such expansion, Durand titled this landscape Progress, the Advance of Civilization, bathing the scene in harmonious, luminous light. As a result, we can read Durand's work as an embrace of the doctrine of manifest destiny, asserting a God-given justification for nationalist expansion, which was the very antithesis of Thomas Cole's beliefs. And I would like to end today by looking at another aspect of Cole's legacy, and one that has more recently been the focus of my research, namely the influence of his Italian landscapes. Although Cole was not the first American artist to travel to Italy, he was the first landscape painter of note to popularize Italian scenes with American collectors, ultimately creating a market for such works in the US that then spurred his followers for generations and generations to travel to many of the same sites that he once visited and sketched. Durand, for instance, found himself in Italy in the early 1840s, sketching the exact section of the Claudian Aqueduct in the Roman Campania that Cole had painted a decade prior. Similarly, George Inness, a canonical figure in American landscape painting, made two Italian sojourns, the first in 1851 and the second in 1870. Both trips had a formative impact on Inness's work, and the Italian landscape offered him a font of inspiration as he developed an evocative aesthetic known as tonalism. In Perugia and the Valley, which is here in the Maier's collection, we see the artist experimenting with these soft focus and diaphanous paint layers that characterized his progressive new style. As the century progressed, the popularity of the Italian landscape among American artists and patrons continued to grow, although the focus shifted from Rome and Florence, the popular destination during Cole's lifetime, to the north, most notably to Venice. Now, Thomas Moran and Thomas Cole, the two artists I have selected to bookend my talk today, at first glance may appear to have very little in common. But having now lived through the Thomas Cole exhibition, and my previous life as a researcher on Thomas Moran, I've come to realize that despite the age difference that separates these two artists, they were born 36 years apart and painted the American landscape at very different moments in the nation's history, that nevertheless, the parallels between their personal lives and professional careers are striking. And I would argue that Moran is an artist whose work would greatly benefit from a reevaluation in an international context, much as we have done for Thomas Cole. Moran was born in 1837 into a family of handloom weavers in Bolton, England, the same small industrial town in which Thomas Cole was born in 1801. And I should say that I have lovingly now dubbed Thomas Moran as Bolton's other American landscape painter. In his youth, Moran immigrated with his family to the United States, settling in Philadelphia, much as Cole had done 2 decades prior. Shortly after his arrival, he pursued a career in the arts, focusing on landscape painting in both oil and watercolor. His early artistic training, which I will delve into in greater detail shortly, was remarkably similar to Cole's. Both men made transatlantic journeys to visit England and Italy at pivotal moments in their careers, and both were profoundly influenced by their encounter with British art, most notably the work of Turner, as well as the classical ruins they sketched in the Italian Campania. And yet, despite Moran's British roots and international travels, he, like Cole, is an artist most closely associated with the American wilderness. While Cole introduced East Coast audiences to the sublime aspects of the Hudson River Valley in the 1820s and 30s, 40 years later, Moran would present them with the splendors of the American West. By the mid-1870s, his name was nearly synonymous with Yellowstone National Park in the state of Wyoming, an association that he encouraged throughout his career, going as far as to adopt the nickname of Thomas Yellowstone Moran, often signing his canvases with a monogram composed of a T and an M, accentuating their overlap to create a Y for Yellowstone. Nevertheless, Thomas Yellowstone Moran was born in Bolton, and I would argue that his vision of the American West was very much shaped by his youth in the north of England, for he, like Cole, experienced the horrors of the Industrial Revolution and later saw and painted the American landscape through the eyes of an economic migrant in the New World. Moran's father was trained as a handloom weaver, but the bleak future of Britain's textile industry forced his family to move to Philadelphia in 1844. Thomas Moran, along with several of his siblings, including both Edward and Peter seen here, would soon emerge as one of America's most influential artist families. Unlike Bolton, Philadelphia offered opportunities for artistic training, education, exhibition, and publication, and as early as 1858, Moran was painting spectacular scenes in watercolor, such as ruins on the Nile. A fantastic image, likely derived from print sources, it reveals his prowess in the medium, and as I've only recently come to recognize, bears a striking resemblance to Thomas Cole's Desolation, with a lone column rising from a heap of classical architectural fragments. Moreover, as an ardent reader of the English critic John Ruskin, Moran spent extended periods of time in nature, making plein-air sketching trips in the forests outside of Philadelphia. His early landscapes also reveal a deep debt to Thomas Cole. In the valley of the Catawissa in autumn of 1862, Moran painted a panoramic prospect, looking down into the valley below, where a river winds its way into the distance. Erasing all human presence from the landscape, he spreads before the viewer a rich array of autumnal foliage, harkening back to the landscapes Cole first painted in the Catskills in the 1820s. Moran's landscape aesthetic developed radically over the course of the next 2 decades, primarily in response to his continued exposure to the work of Turner. He made 2 transatlantic trips in the 1860s, visiting London to study the English master's landscapes firsthand. Turner's use of color had a profound impact on his development, and he copied some of his most luminous pictures, including Dido built in Carthage, which he saw at the National Gallery in London. Although many of Moran's contemporaries were drawn to study in Paris, he was far more interested in the landscape of Italy. Following in the footsteps of Cole and Durand, he too found himself in the Roman Campania, sketching, yet again, that same section of the Claudian aqueduct with the medieval Tor Fiscale seen in the distance. Much like the scholarship on Thomas Cole before our recent exhibition, the international character of Moran's career has often been ignored by scholars of American art. His story tends to begin in Yellowstone in 1871, as if the artist emerged out of a geyser with this innate ability to see and paint the Western American landscape. Yet his British roots and transatlantic travels, which I've really only begun to scratch the surface of here today, had a profound influence on how he depicted the American West. When he arrived out west, he carried with him the memories of Bolton's Industrial Revolution, the work and color palette of Turner, and the ancient ruins of Rome. During his first trip to Yellowstone, he sketched extensively in watercolor, creating exquisitely stunning views of the region's crystal-clear glacial lakes and hot springs, with rising mists and striated sandstone, chiseled peaks, and geological formations. Capturing the sublimity and spectacle of the Western American landscape, these works are often devoid of human presence, or as seen here, include small figures incorporated to create a sense of scale and enhance the awe-inspiring qualities of the scene. Upon returning to the East, Moran's Yellowstone watercolors were strategically used in a promotional campaign to convince the United States Congress to set the lands of Yellowstone aside for a national park. With incredible expediency, unlike anything we see in Washington, D.C. today, it took the House and the Senate only a matter of months to approve the proposed bill to establish what was dubbed a Great Public Park. Signed into law by Ulysses S. Grant on March 2, 1872, the establishment of Yellowstone National Park was said to have been directly impacted by the watercolors of Moran, which were, according to a contemporary historian, quote, the most important exhibits brought before the committee. They did the work which no other agency could do, and doubtless convinced everyone who saw them that the regions where such wonders existed should be carefully preserved to the people forever. In a blog post written shortly after the opening of our Thomas Cole exhibition at the Met, our critic Tyler Green argued that Cole's career marked the beginning of a nearly 30-year process leading to the federal preservation of a specific landscape, what we now call a national park, an idea that spread across the United States and the world. If Bolton's first American landscape painter set that process into motion, then its second helped bring it to fruition. And yet it's important to note that Moran never set out to establish a national park, and his attitudes toward environmental preservation were ambiguous at best. In fact, when the bill was passed in Washington, the artist had not yet completed a large-scale landscape of the region. At the time, he was working away in his studio in Newark, New Jersey, from the numerous watercolor sketches to create this monumental landscape, one that would put him on the map as the painter of Yellowstone. Motivated, I would argue, more by professional and commercial gain than environmental justice, he finally completed the picture, entitled The Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, in June of 1872, selling it shortly thereafter to the US Congress for the then enormous sum of $10,000. The work was subsequently installed in the Capitol building and marked a major turning point in the artist's career. The finished painting does not depict one particular place, but was a composite based on several viewpoints and sketches. Moran was often unfettered by fact. His was an art inspired as much by the imagination as by the literal lay of the land. His vision of the West was an idealized romanticization of a pre-industrial landscape, a vision that appealed to his own personal sentiments, but perhaps more importantly to those of his patrons. For Moran's Western excursions were almost always financed by industrialists and railroad barons, who sought out pristine images of the land that they hoped to develop, sell, and then profit from. And so, unlike Thomas Cole, who railed against the copper-hearted barbarians and dollar-godded utilitarians who were cutting down the trees to build a railroad, Moran was on their payroll, painting imagined views of a landscape that no longer existed, if it ever existed at all. For this land was never pristine and untouched, but rather had been the home for hundreds of thousands of years to Native American communities who were forcibly removed from their land to make way for this pristine national park. Rather than preserving the wilderness, as Cole had hoped his landscapes would do, Moran's works promoted nature as a space for travel, tourism, and economic development. Now, despite his reputation as Thomas Yellowstone Moran, great painter of the American West, he also garnered significant acclaim and financial gain during his own lifetime from his Italian landscapes. After his first two influential trips in the 1860s, Moran returned to Italy in 1886 and again in 1890, this time visiting Venice. Taken by the nautical spectacle, he created colorful pictures of sails and sketched many of the well-known structures lining the Grand Canal in both graphite and watercolor. He would continue to paint Venetian landscapes until his death, exhibiting at least one view of Venice at the National Academy of Design in every year that he submitted pictures for the exhibition. These works reveal the artist to be a true master colorist, rivaling not only the works of his contemporaries, but also those of his predecessors, including Turner. Moreover, they were his best-selling pictures, eventually surpassing in popularity his depictions of the West. For American audiences, a painting such as A View of Venice was, in effect, a nostalgic image of a pre-industrial past. The brightly colored gondolas and fishing vessels that plied the waters offered a stark contrast to their rapidly industrializing society, which was pushing full steam ahead into the 20th century. One can only wonder if the American public had heeded Cole's visual warnings more than half a century prior, if Moran's nostalgic fictions of both the West and of Italy would have made such a profound mark. Thank you. Absolutely, especially through Durant. Because Durand and Kensett were very close. They traveled around together. To my knowledge, I don't know if Cole knew Kensett during his lifetime. It's possible that he did. I get Kensett sort of came onto the scene a little bit later, but certainly Asher B. Durand was a critical figure in that sense, in that he really connected the teachings of Cole, which I should add, he ended up taking a lot of credit for himself, and why he had to do so much of this work to show that Cole had in fact really originated a lot of these ideas about landscape painting, and Durand was hugely influential on that next generation, which included Kensett, absolutely.
And which way did Kensett go about nature and development?
That's a good question. I don't know that he had necessarily strong feelings one way or the other. And it's worth stating that Durand never really expressed, at least to my knowledge, in his writings, especially strong feelings about preserving the environment. I mean, there was certainly this incredible deep admiration for the wilderness, which they all shared, but I think the later generations of artists, especially after mid-century, tended to adopt the ideas of their contemporaries, that manifest destiny and westward expansion was a good thing, that it was progress. Cole was really an outlier in that sense, and was very much seems to us today to perhaps be progressive and forward-looking, but in his own time was seen as being very conservative and backward-looking. He wasn't sort of getting on board with what the future was. Yeah. Yeah.
Was it common for the artists around Cole's time to write notes about the quality of light, and did it get more interesting and technical than Burrow light?
Yes, absolutely. So the question, in case you couldn't hear it, was whether or not it was common for artists to make notations in their drawings about the nature of light. That was something that Cole did very early on. His drawing technique was that he would do a very rough outline, and then through notes, make indications of color and light. And that was a practice that he then passed on to both Durand and Church, and Thomas Moran similarly did graphic drawings in that way. I think paying close attention to the effect of light on the landscape was something that all landscape painters needed to do. But I think
they all kind of put it into words, or a lot of them did?
Well, a lot of the Americans did. I think that artists like Constable and Turner tended to do it more through direct observation and painting in oil or watercolor out of doors in front of the landscape. But we really see in the United States especially, because until Cole, sketching out of doors in oil was not an established practice, that it was done primarily through graphic drawing, sometimes with small watercolor notations, but mostly through handwritten notations of what they were seeing. Absolutely. Yes?
I'm interested how you go from a painting itself to the values of the artist. For example, in the Course of Empire, are you saying that the middle one with the big, all the architecture is something that Cole did not like and thought was ugly, or was that his idea of beauty? I mean,
Sure. So a lot of
I know if you've got the title like Durant's that says progress, that indicates what he thought about it. But to me, that painting was far more condemnatory of industrialization than the one with the little train going through the Acadian landscape.
I think a lot of it, luckily for us, Thomas Cole wrote extensively throughout his lifetime. And because he wrote correspondence to patrons and artists' friends, because he extensively journaled, and then in 1836, the same year that he finished the Oxbow and the Course of Empire, he published his great essay on American scenery, in which he outlines for us many of these ideas. So, I mean, to a certain extent, we art historians read and interpret pictures, and those interpretations can be very subjective and up for argument. I think in this case, though, Cole really told us in his writings, which are then supported by the visual evidence, what he thought. Yes?
I saw the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone about 25 years ago. It
Yeah.
was at the National Portrait Gallery. It's a magnificent painting, and right beside it, as I remember, is one of equal magnificence by him of the Grand Canyon in Arizona. Do you know if it's still at the National Portrait Gallery?
I believe that, I think it's at the National Gallery of Art, or let me go back, it might be, it's at the Smithsonian American Art Museum.
Yeah.
And they are.
Well, that's part of it.
Yes, and they're on
Yeah.
long-term loan from the Department of the Interior, yeah. They're still there.
They're huge paintings. They're at least as big as that screen
Yeah.
there, as I remember.
Really monumental, absolutely. Yes?
Did Cole
notes when he traveled to the White Mountains? Do we know the path that he took to get to the White Mountains? Do we know what towns he went through? Did he make any observations along the way?
Yes, absolutely. So he was actually following on his early trips in 27 and 28. He was following an itinerary that had been laid out for him by Daniel Wadsworth, who was one of his great patrons who collected many, many of his landscapes and who then later founded the Wadsworth Athenaeum. And so Wadsworth had a pretty specific itinerary for him and told him exactly where to go and what to see. And then on his journey, he certainly through his sketches, we know exactly where he was because he would often label them with the name of the town or the mountain peak that he was looking at. And then he wrote in his journal all the time about everything that he was seeing and the places that he visited. So off the top of my head, I don't know that itinerary, but it's certainly something that could be easily accessible. Yes?
The people buying Moran's nostalgic views in Italy, were they the same people who could do the Grand Tour, or were they buying those paintings in lieu of visiting Italy? And were these clients also collecting old master paintings and Italian Renaissance?
Yeah, that's a good. So the question for those of you, I don't know if you could hear, was who essentially were the patrons for Moran's Italian landscapes. I think that it was a mix. It was, for the most part, individuals who themselves went on the Grand Tour and had them as these kind of mementos of their trips. And collectors in the United States at that time were collecting both works by contemporary American artists and old masters. I think the answer to that question probably depends on who the collector was and what their financials would allow them to collect. But that was the 1870s and 80s. Around the same time also, for example, that works by the French Barbizon School were becoming increasingly popular and American collectors were buying those up in droves. So landscape paintings were especially popular with American patrons at the end of the 19th century, whether they were views of the New World or the Old World.
Any other questions? One more? Please stay and enjoy the reception in Gallery 2. You can continue conversations with Dr. Vittoria there. And also please explore Developed and Disturbed, Visions of the American Landscape. This is an exhibition curated by 3 Randolph students, and I think they might be here actually. And they touch on a lot of the things that Dr. Vittoria talked about in her lecture. So thank you, Dr. Vittoria.